our final speaker today, Dr. Andrew Newberg. So Dr. Newberg is a neuroscientist, author, professor, and the research director in the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. He studies how brain function is associated with various mental states and is a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, a field known as neuroethology. Dr. Newberg's research has included brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states, as well as surveys of people's spiritual experiences and attitudes. He has also evaluated the relationship between religious or spiritual phenomena and health, and the effect of meditation on memory. He believes that it is important to keep science rigorous and religion religious. Some of his books include How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, The Metaphysical Mind, and Words Can Change Your Brain. You can learn more about Dr. Newberg's work at www.andrewnewberg.com. So really excited about this final talk. And Dr. Newberg, whenever you're ready, we'll just get started.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited to be able to share with you some of the research I've been engaged with over the last really 25 or 30 years. I don't feel that old, but I guess I am. And but it's been a lot of very exciting for me. It's an area, as you will see, that I'm very passionate about, and hopefully I can make all of you passionate about these same kinds of topics. So the title of my talk is Neuroscience, Spiritual Experiences, and Self-Transformation. It grows a little bit out of the work that I did on the topic of enlightenment or awakening. And in fact, when we start to think about these kinds of questions and these kinds of topics, what I want people to realize is that there are a lot of, we have to sort of start with what the experiences are. As you heard in my introduction, I believe it's really essential to keep science rigorous, meaning that we do good science, but you need to keep the religious, the spiritual, meaning that you have to understand what people are really feeling and thinking about. Because if we don't understand the subjective qualities of these experiences, then whatever we can say is going on in the brain or in the body, it doesn't really have any meaning unless you can connect the two. So a lot of my research has been doing brain scans, but a lot of it has been doing a variety of different surveys and trying to understand what people really feel and think about when they say, I feel spiritual, or I feel like I have had a spiritual or a mystical experience or an enlightenment experience. And in fact, as this first slide shows, the notion of enlightenment has many different terms. I could have put any of these words as the first word, as the title word on the slide. Things like knowledge, wisdom, awakening, transformation, self-realization, holiness, pure consciousness. So all of these things are part, or could be a part, of a person's experience of enlightenment. But we need to go further. We need to really understand what these different terms mean. And then ultimately, we need to think about how they link up to what's going on in our brains so that we can try to best understand them. And as you also heard in the introduction, this really, to me, fills in a field called neurotheology, which is looking to find the relationship between our spiritual selves and our biological cells, what's going on in our brain, as well as what is going on in terms of our own experiences and our own sense of spirituality. Now, I want to take a little step back and talk about this concept of enlightenment in particular, and which really, again, has a lot to do with transformation. And I think what I'm going to talk about now over the next few minutes about what enlightenment is can really apply to any of these kinds of terms, because basically there are sort of the small experiences, the small transformational experiences, and then there are the big ones. So when we talk about, for example, enlightenment, we talked about in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, the differentiation between the big E enlightenment experiences and the little e enlightenment experiences. And the little e experiences are basically defined by the term itself, basically that it is shedding some light on our ignorance of a particular part of our lives, a particular question, a particular issue. It brings us out of the darkness. And part of why I think these experiences are helpful for all of us is that we've all had them. So, not all of us have struck the big, Buddha type of enlightenment, but almost all of us have had these little aha moments in our lives. They're things where we, struggling with a problem at work or a problem with a relationship or, what to do with our lives or something like that. And we work on it, we try to figure out an answer to a problem, and then suddenly, we're kind of struck with some little insight into what to do. So it helps us to solve this particular problem. It helps us to figure out a new way of thinking about a particular thing that we are dealing with. But that is different than the bigger experiences, the big E experiences. In those kinds of really big transformational experiences, it's not just the solution to one problem, but it's like the solution to all problems. Our entire worldview is transformed. Our values, our morals, our sense of spirituality, our sense of self, everything is just rewritten in our own brains and in our spirit, our soul, whatever terms you want to ultimately use for that. Many people feel that this is the highest experience an individual can attain. And of course, there are examples of such experiences really in every culture, in every tradition, and throughout time. So to me, as a neuroscientist now coming at this question, it is important for me to say, well, gee, this is something that seems to be a universal quality. And perhaps we can try to understand it more and understand how that universal quality is attached to the universal elements of the human brain. So when we think about these kinds of transformational enlightenment experiences around the world, the most common ones that people think of are basically derived out of the Eastern philosophies. So Eastern philosophies typically define enlightenment as the highest level of consciousness a person can attain. It's a little bit different in each tradition. For example, in Hinduism, consciousness is seen as the essence from which the universe emerged. So enlightenment really means that you become one with this fundamental reality. That's a little different than Taoism, for example, in which enlightenment refers to the principal concept of Taoism, which is the way, the kind of the natural flow of life, the universe. And so when you become in harmony with this overall approach, this overall way of being, then this is exactly what we see, this is what people call enlightenment. In Buddhism, enlightenment is a bit more personal. It's brought about through meditation and a whole process of self-reflection. Of course, this can take different ways of doing it, different perspectives. In Zen Buddhism, for example, typically it has to do with realizing that there's this kind of there's the illusion of the mind, there's the illusion of our everyday reality, and we kind of confront that and realize that all of that is an illusion, if you will, and that there's a new way of thinking about things. So these are a little, very brief descriptions. Obviously, that you could spend an entire series of lectures on any one of these topics, but just to give a perspective of what we're talking about. Now, in the monotheistic traditions, in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there are also a notion of enlightenment. Now, typically, they don't talk about enlightenment as a term. If you go into the Judeo-Christian Bible, and the word there is some use of the word, and in general, it kind of means what we're talking about. But there is certainly this notion, especially in the mystical traditions of each of these monotheistic traditions, a very similar kind of concept to what we saw in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions. So in Judaism, for example, Kabbalistic teachings basically strive to achieve a mystical union with God. That is what the enlightenment kind of experience is. That's what the goal of what you're striving for is. In Sufism, which is the mystical sect of Islam, we see also a similar kind of concept of mystical union with God through the Quranic teachings, and ultimately a surrender to God. So there is that little distinction here of not just becoming one with God, but kind of surrendering to God. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, because there's some interesting differences in terms of how people understand those kinds of concepts. In Christianity, again, somewhat similar in terms of becoming one with God, a sense of unknowing, so to speak, and being in God's presence. It's a little bit more personal in some regards, but again, there's a lot of overlap between each of these kinds of traditions. And again, the term enlightenment is not typically used, but these kinds of mystical unions are certainly described, and there is this sense that there is some state that one gets to, which is the ultimate state that one can achieve. Now, interestingly, as we were studying Enlightenment, of course, we also came across the Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s, where, interestingly, it took Enlightenment in an entirely different direction. It basically said, we have to get away from religion and spirituality, and we have to move towards rationality, scientific method, and so forth. To us, this was fascinating because it was still talking about the notion of awakening, of getting to some new way of looking at the world, transforming the self, but it goes in a whole different direction. It's non-spiritual. It was defined not as becoming religious or spiritual, but as a freedom from religiousness and spirituality. Kant, for example, defined it as being the emancipation of human consciousness from a state of ignorance. It was believed that religion and spirituality were sort of these more primitive perspectives on things, and the scientific rational methods were what we needed to use going forwards. But again, from a brain perspective, it was still this notion of achieving some new way of thinking about things, of looking at the world from a different perspective. So that radical shift is what we're talking about when we talk about these kinds of experiences. So now we've talked a little bit about what enlightenment and these kinds of self-transforming experiences are about. But exactly where do they begin? Can we look at some aspect of this going on in the brain itself? So this is the beginning of the next part of what we're going to be talking about. And I want to make sure that everyone is at least on the same page, at least as far as understanding the brain, because we're going to be referring to a number of these areas a little bit later on. For example, so this is an image of the brain, a figure of the sort of the side view of the brain, is like if you're looking from the side of a person. And if you look towards the left of the slide, the large area is the frontal lobe, and I've sometimes referred to this as an attention area. This is an area that does a lot of different things, as do all areas of the brain. But in particular, it's helpful for focusing attention, for helping people to concentrate. And we'll see how this plays out when we talk about different practices like meditation or prayer. The temporal lobe along the side of the brain is very involved in both visual processing, that's at the lower part of the temporal lobe, and then at the junction of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, the back part of the brain, is what I sometimes refer to as a verbal conceptual area. So this is where we have our language abilities, a lot of our rational abilities, causality seems to be in this area, mathematics. And so, when you do start to think about these different terms of what wisdom, enlightenment, so forth, all these different language terms that we're using, it's this part of the brain, this part of the temporal lobe, and really the junction of the temporal and the parietal lobe, where we start to see these processes taking place. And then we get to the parietal lobe, which is more in the back of the brain. This is an area that takes a lot of our sensory information, and using that sensory information helps us to establish our sense of self. So that helps us to just kind of navigate ourselves through the world. But as we will see a little bit later when we look at some of the brain scans, this is when we talk about becoming one, when we talk about losing the sense of self, this is part of the areas of the brain that seem to become involved in that. And then a little bit deeper inside the brain, particularly in the temporal lobes, we have the limbic system. And the limbic system, which many of you may have heard of, is involved primarily in emotional processing. Areas particularly like the amygdala and the hippocampus are involved in our emotional responses to the world, identifying things that are particularly important, either good or bad. And then also for writing that information into our memory. And that makes a lot of sense, actually. You want to remember the things that are emotionally salient to you. And you can kind of forget about a lot of the other things that happen in your regular day. But if something really important happens, that's what you want to remember. And you can even see some other areas of the brain here, like the cingulate cortex, which is kind of between the limbic system and the higher parts of the brain that we were just talking about. So that's what helps to connect our emotions and our thoughts. And that's a very important aspect of enlightenment experiences, philosophy, science, everything that we do and think about. The emotions and our rationality all kind of work together to help us figure out what's going on in the world. So now to get a little bit more specific about the aspects of these experiences and how they relate ultimately to the brain, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a survey that we ran. Again, I'm bouncing back and forth a little bit between understanding the experiences on one hand and understanding what's going on in the brain on the other hand. So when we look at the experiences themselves, we really, after we had done scans on about 100, 150 individuals doing all different kinds of practices, we realized that we needed to get a little bit more of a handle of what these experiences were really like, and not just I felt one with God, but what were the emotions, what were the thoughts, what were the feelings, what were the experiences like? So we ran an online survey where we asked people to describe their most intense spiritual experiences. And we received about 2,000 responses to all of this over a period of about 5 or 6 years. We got all kinds of demographic information, religious information, and we also had them fill out a whole bunch of questionnaires about their religiosity and different ways that they thought about the world. And we got narrative descriptions of these experiences. So we have, about 2,000 people who said, who in the little word box told us exactly what they felt. And it was, fascinating to me as someone who's been looking at this for many, many years, but really helps us to understand now how we can start to tie the areas of the brain that we were just talking about into what's going on with these experiences. So I want to show you a little bit of the results of that. We published this information in several different articles. This is just a fun word cloud where we took all of the descriptions and then you ask it to create this word cloud of the most used words during these descriptions. So you can see relatively quickly that things like reality, certainly experience, because we were asking about their enlightenment or their spiritual experiences, notions of God, spirituality, life, feelings, and then you get more and more detail all the way back. But what was fascinating about this ultimately was that when we actually did what's called a content analysis to look at the words and how they were used, while we could start to figure out that there were certain universal elements to these experiences, there was such an incredible diversity of them as well. No two were alike. And I think that's really important for us to understand that while we can try to say, well, a sense of oneness, or we're going to talk about the core elements in just a few moments, everybody's experience seems to have a uniqueness to them. And I think that that's an important takeaway message. In fact, it's a larger takeaway message of the whole field of neurotheology, which is that we recognize that everyone seems to have a slightly different experience about their religious or spiritual attitudes. And as I always like to say, if there are 7.5 billion people in the world, there's 7.5 billion religions. And honestly, I mean, even when you look at people who don't have a religious or spiritual background, who consider themselves atheists, within atheists, there's lots of different ways of looking at that, all the way from those who just don't believe in God to those who don't believe in anything beyond what is just the material world, and all different degrees and variations in between. So when we did look at all of these descriptions, as I mentioned, and we look at how different words were used, and we could group certain words together. So for example, we might, in the term unity, include things like oneness, connectedness, wholeness, interwovenness. So all of these words become a sense of unity. And we realized that there were 5 main core components of these kinds of intense enlightenment experiences. And I'm going to expand on each of these, but essentially they were a sense of intensity, a sense of clarity, a sense of unity, a sense of surrender, and a sense of permanence, or transformative permanence, I should say. So what do I mean by each of these? I want to spend a little bit more time growing these out and talking about them. Well, when it comes to intensity, what we're talking about is that these are the most intense experiences that anyone has ever had. For the individual, they describe it in such a way, it's the most whatever. It could be the most powerful feeling, the most powerful sense of love, the most powerful light, whatever it is. And here's an interesting example. One of my favorite examples was a 43-year-old male who said, "I, as an unnameable but individual being, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real," and that was his capitalizations, not mine, "than anything I had ever experienced." So, here's just a wonderful example of the intensity of the experience. So many words in here are about intensity. infinite, ecstatic, pure, overwhelming, infinitely more real than anything experienced. And that's part of what really allows these, tells people that these experiences are so important. They are the most intense experiences, and that intensity is what identifies them as being transformative and as being spiritual. However the person identifies it, it's the intensity of it is one of the key elements of that experience. Now, where does intensity occur? Well, we've already talked about this a little bit. Oh, wait. Well, I apologize. I'm going to have to just sort of talk you through this one, because this is usually a scan that kind of morphs from the baseline to the actual meditation scan. But hopefully you can make this out. So this is a Spect Scan, and this is what we've used for a lot of our brain scan studies. The colors themselves represent the activity in the brain, with the red colors representing the most activity, followed by the yellow, the blue, and the black. And what we do is these scans usually are done by injecting people with a little bit of a radioactive tracer that follows blood flow as it gets into the brain. And it works well because the more blood flow a particular part of the brain gets, the more it's being used. So if you're solving a math problem, and you're using your mathematical areas of the brain, then those would be the areas that would get more blood flow so that they could do that processing. And then when you finish solving the math problem, they settle back down to the kind of baseline level of activity. So we always have some kind of baseline scan, and then we have a scan, usually during some state, some kind of practice. And where you're looking at this particular scan where the arrow is pointing, you can see this kind of large blob of red activity. Now, I apologize, because I guess I didn't realize that we wouldn't be able to do this kind of merge from one image to the next on the same slide. But if you look at the other side of the scan in the same area, that's what the baseline looked like. It was mostly just kind of yellows and maybe a little bit of red. But when the person now is deeply engaged in meditation or prayer, they activate this area of the brain. And this is the limbic system. This is in that middle part of the temporal lobe. So this is part of your amygdala and your hippocampus. And as you remember, these are the areas that are involved in emotional responses. And so we expect there to be this very strong emotional change in the brain. And that's part of what signifies this experience as being a very powerful, very intense experience. So this scan helps to demonstrate for us that this limbic system is part of what helps the person feel this powerful sense of intensity as the result of this experience. Another core component of these experiences is a sense of clarity. For me, the best way I think about this is, for the person, they get it. They just suddenly get the world for the first time ever, maybe. They understand the way the world works. They understand what their path is in life, what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to act. They understand if there's a God, if there isn't a God, whatever they've understood, they now get it. And it is a sense of clarity. And that is very much what enlightenment itself means. But any of these transformational experiences, it is that the person finally understands the world and themselves in a way that they never have before. So here is an interesting description of this from a 37-year-old female scientist, as she described herself. And she said this about her experience. She said, "Everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered some sort of direct experience that offered up proof." So we see here that we had this scientist who had this incredible spiritual experience. And again, they talk about it in terms of clarity, understanding life from the inside out, very proof-oriented, offering some kind of proof and understanding that never occurred before. So again, now we can talk about, well, where in the brain might a sense of clarity come about? So where these arrows are pointing is a very central group of structures called the thalami, or the thalamus, and there's a left and a right thalamus. It turns out that when we look at the brain of people who are non-meditators, who have not had these kinds of experiences, The two sides of the thalamus are relatively equal. So that was the pre-slide that I was about to show. And again, I apologize that you can't see that. But on this slide, you can see that one thalamus, a little bit further away from the arrow, is more red, and then where the arrow is pointing is sort of more yellow. And so we see this asymmetry in this very central structure called the thalamus. So I haven't talked about the thalamus yet. So what does it do? Well, because it's so central, it helps many different parts of the brain to connect and communicate with each other. It also brings a lot of our sensory information, particularly from our eyes and ears, up into the brain. So in many ways, the thalamus is essential for helping us to establish our sense of reality. And some people have even argued that the thalamus is the seat of consciousness, because the thalamus in particular shuts down when we're under anesthesia, for example. So the thalamus is clearly a very central, very important structure, and seems to be different in those people who have very intense experiences. And I think, while we haven't proven this yet, I think this might be a very interesting area for us to look at when it comes to a sense of clarity and that sense of transformation that changes the way and all the different ways in which different parts of our brain connect and communicate with each other. Even though we're talking about specific areas of the brain, it is important for all of you to know that over the last maybe 5 or 10 years, a lot of cognitive neuroscience has moved away from the specific, the exploration of specific areas, and started talking more and more about networks. And the thalamus is a very central structure for a lot of these networks that allow all these different parts of the brain to connect together to be able to do different things for us. So this to us is also a very important part of how we start to understand these experiences, and specifically this notion of clarity. The feeling of unity. This to us is a very important and very core component of these experiences. Almost everyone describes a sense of oneness, unity, connectedness with the universe, with God, with universal consciousness. And I think that this is where the parietal lobes start to come in. As I mentioned, the parietal lobes turn on when we establish our sense of self, and we take the sensory information to be able to do that. Well, what would happen if that area of the brain started to decrease in activity? What happens if through a practice like meditation, you screen out so much information that the parietal lobes just don't have a lot of information to work on? Well, over time, as the parietal lobes start to shut down, if we normally would have our sense of self by turning on our parietal lobes, then we lose our sense of self. And we also lose the boundary between ourselves and the rest of the world. So we can feel a oneness with God, with all things, with all of humanity, whatever the particular experience is about. This kind of feeling of unity can be very, very powerful and very important part of these experiences, and then leads to a more sort of cognitive approach to understanding the fundamentals of what these experiences are about. So we might understand the concept of God as the unifying force of the universe. Or if we have a notion of, like in Christianity, the Trinity, understanding how these individual characteristics of God are still part of a whole. So however a person, whatever tradition a person comes from, this notion of oneness and unity, and most importantly, as part of the experience, feeling connected to that oneness, to becoming one with the universe, seems to involve the parietal lobes and seems to involve those ways in which we experience the world around us. So here is yet another Spect Scan of a person during intense meditation. And again, I don't have the pre, but on the pre, the whole brain looks about the same level of redness as you're seeing here. But where the arrow is pointing during the meditation practice, you can see that this part of the parietal lobe now suddenly comes, as a lot more in the yellows and just a little bit of red. It's certainly very asymmetric compared to what you see on the other side of the brain. So these areas of the parietal lobe in the back of the brain are very much affected by these intense practices. And this is what we see over and over again in practices that lead to an experience of oneness as the person gets into these kinds of mystical union experiences, enlightenment experiences, and transformational experiences. The fourth criteria, the fourth component, I should say, is a feeling of surrender. And what I mean by that? Well, when people have these experiences, and maybe many of you have had such an experience, what people frequently describe is they're not making it happen. It is an experience that is happening to you. Now, you may have been striving for it. You may have been engaged in a meditation program for many, many years, trying to achieve some kind of enlightenment or something like that, some kind of awakening. But at some point, the experience kind of takes you over, and you allow it to happen. You're along for the ride. So this feeling of surrender, which is particularly prominent in the Islamic tradition, but we see this in many different perspectives and from many different practices and individuals. So here is a very interesting description of a sense of surrender from a 48-year-old Catholic woman. She said this. She said, "I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's action all around me." So this actually is an interesting kind of hybrid description of not only the sense of surrender, but that feeling of oneness. There's no distance, no separation between this person and God, but it was achieved through a sense of surrender. So where does surrender occur in the brain? Well, we talked about the frontal lobes early on as being this area of the brain that we use when we are purposefully doing something, when we're concentrating on something. And the frontal lobes, when we look at meditation practices in general, when you are focusing your attention on your breath, on an object, on a phrase or a mantra, then we tend to see increased activity in the frontal lobes. So on these kinds of brain scans, it would be an area of increased red activity. But when people ultimately do have these kinds of intense experiences, and this particular scan is from a study that we did of Islamic prayer, where they feel that sense of surrender, the frontal lobes actually shut down. So again, I think this is the last time I'll apologize for this. I don't have the pre-scan, which was just their resting scan, but where these arrows were for a fair amount of red activity. But now you can see during the prayer state that it's almost all in yellows and greens, and there's almost no red at all in that frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe actually started to shut down as the person felt this sense of surrendering oneself to God. And again, to me, this just makes a lot of sense that if the frontal lobe turns on when we are doing something purposeful and we're trying to do something, then when we surrender that purposefulness, that frontal lobe actually starts to shut down. And that's exactly what we see in these kinds of experiences and these kinds of practices. Now, the fifth aspect of these experiences, and more directly related to the title of the talk, is the transformation. So this to me is also quite fascinating as a neuroscientist, that we are looking at not just these experiences, but what these experiences do to somebody. And in fact, going back to the term enlightenment, what's also kind of interesting about that is that it's used in two different kinds of contexts. One is the experience of enlightenment, when you achieve enlightenment, when you become enlightened, but which is the moment that this transformation occurs. But it also has a different term when you are enlightened. So you have had the experience, and what happens to the person going forward? They now have a different perspective on everything, as I mentioned from the beginning. So it changes the way they think about their lives, their jobs, their relationships, and so forth. And this was part of the survey that we did, where we asked people the question about, what is actually transformed for you, and how is it transformed? Does it actually make things better or worse? What's happening? And I was really very struck by this table that we put together, again, using these couple thousand people. If you look at this, over 50%, and depending on the particular question we were asking about, religiousness and spirituality, up to 90% felt that their senses of these different terms became better. So their family relationships, 50%, over 50, almost 60% got better. Their fear of death, 75% got better. Their sense of health and well-being got better. So, these experiences have an enormous transformational effect. Now, everybody's a little bit different. So some people, they did say, well, my family relationships didn't change that much, but my sense of spirituality changed a lot. In fact, again, the sense of spirituality is over 90%. So, I mean, that's really pretty incredible what we're seeing here in terms of the effects that people have. And so there's this unbelievable transformation that is a part of all of these experiences. Now, you also may notice in this table that there are a percentage of people, although very small, usually a couple of percent, that said that things got worse. Now, from a neurotheological perspective, this is actually a very interesting thing, a very interesting finding, and something that is very important for us to begin to look at. On one hand, these experiences seem quite rosy. Everybody seems to do a lot better with these experiences, and they feel that it's really changed their lives for the better. But there are a percentage of people who feel like it hasn't helped them, and it actually may hurt them in certain ways. And I think, in terms of the brain itself, we need to understand what those negative experiences are about. What's going on? Did their amygdala turn on in such a way that made them feel more negative emotions and feelings of fear, for example, as opposed to feelings of love and compassion and understanding? Did they have a very positive experience, but they had trouble integrating it into their prevailing belief system? And we see this happen over and over again, where somebody, may have grown up Catholic and feels very strongly about their Catholic tradition, and then they have some incredible experience, a near-death experience or something like that, that doesn't feel anything like Catholicism to them, and then they don't know what to do. And then they go to their clergy, or they go to a family member who kind of, blows them off and makes them feel like, something crazy happened to them. So, we need to understand what's going on with the negative side of these experiences as much as we need to understand what's going on with the positive side of these experiences. But part of what is, to me, very important about all of this is, trying to understand what these transformations are about, and also exactly what, how they happen. And this, to me, is something which is, very, very important. That when we think about the transformation itself, how is it happening? Because when you think about the brain and you think about how it works in general, it tends to work slowly over time. When we go to school to learn about, to become a mathematician or become a scientist or become a philosopher or whatever, it takes many, many years of reading and learning and studying and developing the brain. And over time, you learn, your brain changes so that you become an expert in a particular area or particular field. It takes time, many, many years. But these kinds of transformational experiences seem to happen in, literally seconds for some people, minutes for others, but in a very, very short period of time, it changes everything about this person's life. How does that happen? The short answer is we don't know. So, to me, there's one of two main possibilities. One is that, much like a lot of the video games today, that, that these beliefs or these ways of looking at the world existed within us. It's like that extra character or that extra, room in the video game that you unlock when you get to a certain point or something like that. So is it possible that, this new way of looking at the world in a very holistic, very compassionate kind of way was always inside of the person, and then when they had this experience, it just opened up that doorway, and now they look at the world in a completely different way? Or is it that the brain literally rewires itself in some way? And I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, there are millions and trillions of connections between different neurons. And so if, it goes this way a little bit and then suddenly it shifts the other way, then you can have a whole different type of experience. But then again, why do so many of these experiences turn into the positive? And I think that these are some fascinating questions for neurotheology to think about. Now, I've used this term neurotheology several times, and you did hear it in my introduction. So I do want to spend a few moments talking about it, just so that everyone understands what it is as a field of study. I'm very passionate about neurotheology, and everything that I think you've been hearing today, even not just from me, but from the other speakers, probably kind of bumps into this notion of neurotheology. So for me, neurotheology is a unique field of scholarship that seeks to understand the relationship, specifically between the brain and theology, but more broadly between the mind and religion. So, I think to me this is a very important point. In fact, let me just jump down a couple to what neuro and theology, how they should be defined very broadly. I think for the term to work, and believe me, we talked about a lot of other, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, where I spend a fair amount of time just talking about what the right term should have been. It could have been psychospirituality or biotheology or whatever. And they're all good terms. I think neurotheology in many ways just kind of sounds the most interesting, the coolest. But I think for it to work as a term, you have to define the neuro and the theology quite broadly for it to work. So we define the neuro side as not just being neuroscience and neuroimaging, but just overall biology and medicine. It can include anthropology, all the different ways that we get at sort of the physical aspect of who we are as a person. And it can include psychology as well, although obviously, it's linking the psychology to what's going on in the brain itself. And it can also include things like consciousness, if you will, and how consciousness might arise and how it's connected to the material parts of our brain. And there are some fascinating issues with all of that. The theology side, also, theology is a specific discipline of taking the kind of fundamentals of a given tradition and trying to analyze them. And so we see this a lot in Christian theology and so forth. But I think theology, we can look at that. We can look at the ways in which we understand concepts of causality and, understand how we read sacred texts and things like that. But we also have to define theology very broadly. So it includes practices like meditation and prayer. It can include different beliefs, different experiences, mystical experiences, enlightenment experiences, all the different aspects that go into what it means for us to be religious or spiritual. And so, I think if you use those two terms very broadly, then neurotheology can work. And of course, it has gotten a lot of attention over the last 10, 20 years. In many ways, it's riding that wave of, there's neuroeconomics and neuropsychology and neuroethology and so forth, all the different ways that we link our brain with human behaviors and attitudes. And I think doing that for religion and spirituality is certainly very relevant as well. I want to be clear, though, that neurotheology to me is also a two-way street. It is not neuroscience looking at religion and spirituality. It is not religion and spirituality looking at neuroscience. But it is really the two sides of humanity, the religious and spiritual on one side and the science and technology on the other, helping them to look at each other to help us understand who we are as best as possible. So ultimately, there are a whole range of different aspects of neurotheology, from the very esoteric to the very practical. And so studies can evaluate the effects of religion and spirituality on the brain, much like what we were just talking about. With the brain scans we were looking at, there can be, very practical applications looking at health-related effects. If you pray, does it reduce anxiety or depression? And all the way to, even more esoteric concepts about, what exactly, is going on when we talk about concepts of free will, of causality, of enlightenment, and can all of this information even provide, some type of new understanding of what enlightenment is and how, and even maybe give us some direction in terms of helping people to achieve these kinds of experiences. And that does lead to towards the end of my talk here. I do want to talk a little bit about this transformational process. How do these practices, in particular, facilitate spiritual experiences? And again, to drive home that other point that I mentioned at the beginning, we have to combine the science with the spiritual. We have to combine the subjective with the objective, so to speak. But we can start to do that. And we did a very interesting study, one of the first longitudinal studies, where we took people who had never really been meditators and we set them on a path of meditation. We actually taught them a practice called Kirtan Kriya meditation, which is a very simple mantra-based meditation that you do it for about 12 minutes a day. And these scans, I finally have a good slide because I didn't actually have the transformation of the slide from one to another. So these 4 scans here represent the scans from one individual. I should parenthetically note that with all of the stuff that I have been telling you about these studies and these scans and pointing out these colors, there's numbers that underlie all of this. So all of this is quantitative, and in the research articles that we do, which I'll give you some information about looking at them later. It's all presented in terms of the quantitative analyses. So you don't just have to take my word for these things, but we actually have, quantitative data that supports all the contentions and all the statements that I'm making. So back to these scans. So these are 4 scans from one individual. The A scan is their very first resting scan, what their brain looked like basically just coming into our lab. Then we taught them how to do the Kirtan Kriya meditation practice, which again is very easy practice to do. And we had them do it for the first time, and that was the B scan. Then we send them home and we have them do the practice for about 2 months, and we bring them back. The C scan represents the baseline scan, again, the new baseline, so to speak. And then the D scan represents their scan in their final meditation practice. So the A and the C scan to me are the most important things to look at on this slide, because this goes into this notion of transformation. This is the resting brain. This is not while they're meditating. This is what their resting brain looks like. And there were 2 very important changes that we note on this particular scan. So one of them doesn't have an arrow, but if you look at the top of the scan, that's where the frontal lobes are. If you look on the A scan towards the top, there's mostly just yellows and greens, maybe a little dollop of red, but not very much. But if you look at the C scan, you can see that parts of that frontal lobe have become more red, especially some of the central areas there, which are part of the cingulate cortex I mentioned a while back. So the frontal lobe at baseline is more active than it was before by doing this practice. This is a really important finding because there are other studies that have shown, and Dr. Lazar probably pointed out a couple of these because these were from some of her research, that the frontal lobes tend to be larger in those individuals who are doing these kinds of practices compared to those people who have not done those practices. So here we see an actual change in the activity level, which is very comparable to what's going on in terms of the thickness of the cortex. So this also, to me, the analogy of a muscle is just very much right on here, that if you lift a lot of weights, the muscle becomes structurally thicker, like the brain, and physically stronger. You can do more with it. And that's what we're seeing here. We're looking at the functional piece here that corresponds also with the structural changes that we see. And interestingly, I mean, we were doing this actually on a more pragmatic level. These were individuals who also were, older individuals who had memory problems. And we showed that it improved their memory and their concentration by about 10%. And it correlated with about a 10% improvement of their frontal lobe activity. So, this to us was very important. And then the other finding that we see is in that thalamus, again, that we were talking about earlier. So if you look in this individual at baseline, there is a little bit of an asymmetry where that arrow is pointing. One side of the thalamus is a bit more active than the other. But if you look at the C scan, it looks like it's almost equilibrated. In fact, if anything, the other side may be a little bit more active. And if you actually go to the D scan, you can see that the other side becomes even more active. So this to us is very interesting and very important because, again, if the thalamus is part of that sense of clarity and that part of how we perceive all of reality together, then we're seeing a shift by doing a very simple meditation, 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And if we can affect these kinds of changes in that period of time with a very, kind of minimalist approach to meditation, you can imagine what's going on in the brains of nuns and monks and people who are doing these kinds of practices for hours a day for years and years of their life. When we did our study of nuns, they had been praying for 50 years. So what's going on and how does that change their perspectives of reality? You can see the incredible power of these practices at transforming and changing the brain. And again, part of what we ultimately need to look at is, are we able to change the brain for the positive to make people have higher levels of cognition, a greater sense of wisdom, a greater sense of love and compassion for other people? Because unfortunately, these practices can also go awry. And various meditations and rituals can be used for, if it winds up creating a very small cohesive group, they can use these same kinds of rituals to produce cults and very negative outward behaviors. So we this is for neurotheology to look at, which is where do we see the positive versus the negative side of these kinds of practices. So in the end, hopefully you have learned a great deal about these transformational experiences and what enlightenment ultimately can do for people. These kinds of experiences have a tremendous impact, both on the brain as well as on the person. The experiences transform their views of reality, their sense of relationships, their sense of what kind of job they should do and how they should do it, their spiritual perspectives, their scientific perspectives. Every aspect of how they think about the world literally can change. So, it really shows how important these experiences are in humanity. And it helps us to understand, by looking at the biology, the kind of universal qualities of these experiences. And that, to me, in many ways, may be the most important take-home and perhaps the most hopeful take-home message of this talk, which is that when we look at these experiences, it seems to me that anyone can have these experiences and that everyone can have these experiences. And that was what was so heartening to me as I read through these, couple thousand descriptions of these experiences. These are not for the Buddhas of the world and the Gandhis of the world and the Mother Teresas of the world. These are for everyone. Some of my favorite descriptions, one of my favorite descriptions of all was like a truck driver who was just driving his truck down the road and suddenly saw like this unifying force of everything and saw the energy and everything. They weren't trying to have these experiences. They weren't particularly religious or spiritual, and yet they did have them. And of course, a lot of people are striving for them and are able to have them as well. And so, to me, there's never a guarantee that people can have them. That's the one downside of them, which is that, we can't find an absolute way to make them happen. But we do know that when people in general start to pursue these kinds of spiritual questions and these spiritual paths, that hopefully, every one of us can find these kinds of experiences in one way or another. But I think, again, to me, the hopeful part is that based on the evidence that we have, and again, when you even just think about how our brains are wired and operate, for the most part, we all have a frontal lobe, we all have a temporal lobe, we all have a limbic system, and they all more or less work the same way. So it makes sense that everyone should be able to have these kinds of experiences. So for those of you who are interested in exploring some of my research further, again, a lot of what I talked about today came out of our book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. And so I'd love to encourage you to do that. And also a book I wrote called Neurotheology, which summarizes a lot of what the field of neurotheology is currently about, how we can start to think about new studies and the questions that we can answer and questions we can ask, and then how we try to find the answers. But there are a lot of fascinating ideas and possibilities as we go forward. And lastly, I do want to just leave you with my website. So for anyone who is interested, it's just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And on there, you can find some of the, the more specific pieces of data from the about the articles that we did, both in terms of the survey data, as well as a lot of the brain scan studies. And you can also keep in touch with some of the other information as we write new articles and new books and so forth on these topics. As much as we have learned, as much as I've been able to share with you in this hour, we're really just scratching the surface, and there is so much more for us to learn and to think about, both in terms of what's going on in the brain and not just areas of the brain's activity, but different neurotransmitters and different networks in the brain. There's all the practical applications of this. There's the philosophical and the theological. There's applying these kinds of questions to all the different traditions. So there is just a ton of work for all of us to do. And I hope that I've at least made a number of you interested in the same topics and the same questions as I have. So thank you very much. And I guess we'll be taking a little break, and I'll be back for some questions. So thank you.
Excellent presentation. We'll take a 5-minute break now, and then we'll come back for about 20 or 30 minutes of Q&A. Anybody, if you've got any questions, just type them into the chat bar, and we'll choose a selection to ask Dr. Newberg. And Dr. Newberg, if you'd like to turn off your camera during the break, you have the option to do that if you see the buttons on the screen.
Sure.
So see you guys soon. Welcome back. So yeah, again, thanks so much for that presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So as a first question, I'd love to ask, okay, so if you were working with somebody and you were giving the task of helping this person to have one of these experiences, like to have a spiritual experience, and you only had a week to for it to happen, how would you approach coaching that person through that experience?
Well, we do look, and we actually discussed this a little bit, maybe not within, for a week, but we do talk about it in How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. What are some of the things that people can do in order to get into these experiences? And I think there's a couple of important pieces to this. One is that a person does have to make a certain degree of preparation for it, and I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a long-term, a lot of time to do it. But they need to be open to the possibility of a transformation. So, if somebody says, no, there's no way I'm going to ever do this, then it's going to be much harder for them to achieve some kind of awakening or enlightenment. So I think part of it is that people have to feel like they are beginning to open themselves up to that possibility, that they, so there needs to be kind of an awareness that it's something that they want and that they are hoping to achieve. Then another really important part, and this is where it's important to kind of individualize it as well as standardize it, is to find a practice or a ritual or some combination of practices and rituals that a person can do. We actually did, I don't know if this is where your question was coming from, we actually did a study that was kind of like this, where we sent people to a retreat program that was based on the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. And there's a retreat center outside of the Philadelphia area where I live and where our university is. And we would scan people, and then we would send them for a week to this retreat center. And in that week, they spend a lot of time in self-reflection, in meditation, in silence. So, now it's prescribed in the sense that, everybody kind of does the same basic thing. And it can be a very effective, approach to do. But the reason I say that it also needs to be individualized is that each person does need to kind of find their own path. And for example, with the exercises of St. Ignatius, since it is developed out of the Jesuit, Christian tradition, we did have a couple of people who were interested in the study who were Jewish, for example. And I said, well, are you going to be okay with the fact that there's kind of Christian undertones to this? And they decided not to participate, which I think was a smart thing, because you still have to tailor it to where you are and where your beliefs are. So, whether that is doing something with Buddhism, Hindu, a tradition that you come from, a tradition that you want to go to. But it's finding those kinds of rituals and really immerse. I mean, again, part of an answer to your question is these people were very immersed in these practices, and many of them did feel, transformed to some degree. I don't think, any of them had kind of a true enlightenment experience. No one came back and said, wow, like I'm different now. Although everyone felt that they had been changed by it, it was sort of more of the slow process as opposed to that kind of mystical moment. But again, I mean, that's also what, we know of, thousands and thousands of monks and nuns who spend, many, many years in meditation and never achieve enlightenment. So, it can take a long, long time. But anyway, the last piece of it is ultimately trying to find a way of kind of releasing oneself and surrendering and letting go. And I think when people can kind of do that combination of preparing, finding the right rituals, and then kind of engaging them, but then finding a way to let go, that gives you your best chance of having that experience. But again, there's certainly no one size fits all, and there's no way to ever guarantee that it will happen for any given individual.
Okay, very interesting. Now, also curious to ask, and maybe you've had one, maybe you haven't, but have you had many of these experiences yourself? And if so, maybe if you could tell us about your first time, or maybe your most profound spiritual experience. And if you don't want to share this, totally fine. We can move on to the next question too. No worries.
Well, thank you for that understanding. I guess as someone in this field and doing all this neurotheology, that's a question that I always expect to get, and I'm not, it's totally fine. In fact, actually, I do talk a little bit about my own personal experiences in How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. And to sort of briefly state it, a lot of how, and it's kind of also included in the whole discussion of how I got into this topic in the first place, which is that when I was growing up, I was always very sort of, I don't know if disturbed is the right word, or concerned, but it bothered me that there were different religions and different political parties. And, I sort of felt like, well, if we're all looking at the same world, how come we're not all coming together with the same conclusion? And so I said, well, to me, the fundamental question is, well, how do we know? And everybody seemed so sure of themselves that everybody was right. So I said, well, how do we know what's real? How do we actually figure out what's real? And I said, well, it must start with the brain, because that's the organ of our cells that helps us to take in all this information and process it and to figure it out. So I started to look at the brain and what we knew about how the brain worked. But over time, I realized that there were certain limitations to what the science could tell us, that especially when it came to things like our own subjective experiences of the world and consciousness. So I started to look at that. I started to look at philosophical ideas and different spiritual traditions, Buddhism and Hindu and so forth, and theology and philosophy. So all of this was kind of swirling around in my head as I tried to explore the question of, what was real. And I began to take this kind of philosophical approach, which I guess I later found out was somewhat similar to what Descartes had done, which made me feel like I was at least on the right track. And so basically what I kind of kept doing with my own way of thinking, it became very contemplative. And I said, well, if there's anything that I'm not sure about, I won't say it's wrong. I'm just going to say I don't know, and so I would say, I doubt it. It goes into this realm of doubt and realm of uncertainty, and over time, more and more stuff went into this realm of doubt. The notions of causality and philosophy and science, and everything kind of went into even my own sense of self and so forth. And finally, in between my college and medical school, I had a summer where I said, I really feel like I got to answer this issue, and so I spent that whole summer really in just kind of a deep contemplative period. And the experience that I had, to now more directly answer your question, was an experience that I sometimes refer to as infinite doubt. What I kind of came to was that it was sort of an infinite regress of doubt. It was that there was nothing that could ever be known. And on one hand, when I have described this to some of my friends and colleagues from time to time, they said, well, that must have been the worst experience you could have ever had. Here you were trying to find an answer, and you came to the notion that you'll never have an answer. And I said, well, I understand why you're saying that, but for me, it was actually one of the most peaceful, most sort of freeing experiences that I ever had. And there were some interesting characteristics of it, because within this infinite doubt, there was no differentiation of, everything was possible, everything was impossible, everything was one. There was no, one way of looking at things. So some of these things that we've later found, is a part of a lot of these experiences, that sense of oneness, unity. Certainly there was no sense of ego self that was guiding this. So I was along for the ride, so to speak. And certainly, it was an incredibly intense experience, because I had never experienced anything like this before. So that to me was my, main experience that I had. And from that point, over the last 30 years or so, I keep kind of going back to that experience and seeing what can come from that. And that's been part of what I do. It's part of what has led me into the whole field of neurotheology. And I haven't figured it out yet. And as I always jokingly say, if I ever do, I will make sure I let everyone know. But it was that experience that also kind of propelled me to want to understand what other experiences were like that people were describing, and see where they were similar or different from the one that I had, so that I could understand my own experience. And again, that has been really, to me, neurotheology is my kind of combined scientific and spiritual path towards understanding the nature of reality, the nature of this experience that I personally had, and trying to see, from that experience, what we can ultimately learn and know about the world. So that's really where I've been going and coming from, and I continue to explore it, and hopefully someday I'll figure it out.
Brilliant. Well, in our pre-call there a couple of days ago, I was asking you about, taking this path. It must have been quite risky from an academic point of view, because there's no guarantees, and for obvious reasons. And what you told me was that you can never get in trouble if you always lead with questions, or if you never claim to have answers and you've only got questions, And from what you've told me now about this sort of realization of infinite doubt, I can see maybe where that maybe came about,
Yeah, I mean, and to me, it's the center of my life and the center of neurotheology. I refer to it as a passion for inquiry. I mean, it's just that we should always be asking those questions. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that's how I wound up, heading towards that infinite doubt of just keep pushing the questions. And again, I mean, as much as of all the things that I talked about today, they're all within that light. I mean, this is what we've learned. This is interesting, but there's always another question. There's always, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? How does it help us to interpret these experiences? Where do we take it? Where can we go? And ultimately, how can it help us? So, but yeah, I mean, it's, to me, I've been very fortunate and been able to do a lot of very, traditional stuff, which continues to kind of fuel my ability to do some of the work that I have been doing in neurotheology. And as you said, I mean, I try to maintain always asking those questions. It's hard to get in trouble when you keep asking the questions. And then when you do offer, well, here's some information, at least an answer that we have for the moment. That's what it is. It's an answer we have for the moment. And there's always going to be more information and more answers and then more questions. And so it just kind of keeps going and going. But that to me is part of what makes it exciting and interesting. Hopefully it'll keep me busy for the next 30 years and hopefully it'll keep me out of trouble.
Brilliant. Okay, so next question is from Gail. Gail asks, how do you describe spirituality versus religion in your definitions? And then there's a couple more actually as well. So she also asks, what do you think about the unilateral changes and alterations in the scans, or were they just cut dependent? And finally, when speaking of consciousness, have you done any work with the brain consciousness and body consciousness? She's a body worker, I'm assuming, in some kind of psychotherapeutic work. And among other things and memories that come up in body work, some memories and trauma come up as well.
Sure. Well, you're probably going to have to remind me of each of the questions, but let me start with the first one, because it is one of my favorite ones. In a book that I wrote called Principles of Neurotheology, the whole first part of it and the whole first piece of neurotheology is definitions. As an academic person or who likes academic stuff, I find that the definition piece really exciting and interesting, even though I guess in some sense it's a little bit stale at times. But there's some fascinating things that come up when we ask the question about definitions. And first of all, it's not just religious versus spirituality, but it's brain versus mind versus soul versus God versus, so all of these terms have to be defined. And how do we define them? And who should define them? Should we have a bunch of religious people define them? Should we have a bunch of theologians, a bunch of anthropologists, a bunch of philosophers, a bunch of neuroscientists? They're all going to come up with different definitions. In fact, that's the exercise that I do is I write, religiousness up on the board and spirituality up on the board and with whatever group I'm working with. And I say, you guys tell me, what you think each of these are. And I love watching the back and forth. Spirituality is the individual and religion is the group. And then somebody says, yeah, but I'm religious and I do it in my own house and I'm totally an individual. And somebody says, I'm spiritual, but I love meditating with the group, and so you get a lot of back and forth. Maybe the thing that differentiates spirituality from religiousness the most is just that religion tends to be defined by a group of people. But again, I mean, so is spiritual, so are different spiritual traditions too. So, certainly there's a lot of overlap. Everyone sort of has their own definitions, and that's important too. And much like the survey studies that we're doing, what we're going to be starting to do is try to get a little bit more of how people define these different terms. Because even if you go to a church and you look at the same 100 people and you ask each of them, what is God in your view, you're going to get all different kinds of answers. So how we define these terms to me is a very exciting part of trying to understand neurotheology. So, but it's a really important question. I appreciate that one. If I understood the second part of the question, I think she was the question was about sort of the different sides of the brain.
The question was, what do you think about the unilateral changes and alterations in the scans, or were these just cut dependent?
Yeah, so we have been looking at this issue about, what areas of the brain are turned on, turned off. There, on one hand, there are differentiations between the two hemispheres of the brain, and sometimes we are seeing laterality changes. Other times we don't. Sometimes we can attribute those to the different aspects of the brain. For example, when it comes to the parietal lobe, there's some evidence to support that the left side of the parietal lobe is a little bit more about self-other, whereas the right side is a little bit more about spatial relations. So that theoretically then, if you have a decrease in the left side, you lose self-other, and you feel, connected to God, for example, or connected to the universe. But if you lose your right side, it's the feeling of oneness of all things. And of course, if you do both, then you lose yourself and become one with all things. So there's subtle differences depending on the circumstance. And then you do get into different practices that are more verbally based, which tends to be more left hemisphere. So we're looking into that, but it's an interesting issue, and it's something for us to think about. In fact, there was a really fascinating study on patients with Parkinson's disease, which can, affect one side or the other or both. And they found that when and I apologize, off the top of my head now, I don't want to quote it because I don't remember which side was which. But when one side was down, people tended to become less religious than when the other side was down. So there's something about the laterality of the brain, but we don't fully know. We're working on that, and we're trying to understand that. And then I think the last question, actually, I'm remembering them, was about the body, consciousness in the body. And, as an integrated medicine doctor, we certainly understand the relationship between the brain and the body. In fact, this may be another real important take-home message from all of the stuff I've been saying. There isn't one God, spiritual part of the brain. There isn't one part of the brain that lights up when we hit enlightenment or anything like that. It's almost all the different parts of our brain, our language, our emotions, our thoughts, and so forth. And again, the brain, as the question is asking, is deeply connected with the body. And so when we think things, when we feel things up in the brain, they're translated to the body. And of course, things that are felt in the body are translated back up to the brain. And where exactly consciousness is in all of this, who knows, but yeah, I think that it is important for us to think about all these different aspects about how our brain is operating, and how the different sides of our brain, different parts of our brain, different parts of our body are all interacting with each other. And that is, to me, a real important area of future work in neurotheology.
100%. It was a great series of questions. Curious to ask you now as well, given all the work that you've done, what's your basic view on consciousness? Do you believe that the brain generates consciousness? Do you think it's like transmitting consciousness? Like what's your take on that?
Well, this hopefully won't come as a shock to anyone listening. I don't know. Is my answer. I could see it. My late colleague Jean DeQuilly and I wrote a paper many years ago, about 30 years ago, called "Consciousness in the Machine," and maybe this is my best answer, but to me it seems like you have sort of two basic possibilities. You have sort of the material. You start with the material world and the brain, and somehow you have to explain the generation of consciousness, which we haven't done yet. So is it possible? Maybe. But we haven't been able to figure that out yet. And maybe, people talk about emergent properties and things like that. So, I don't want to say that we'll never do it, but that seems, that's the leap that needs to be made. You could start with kind of consciousness as the fundamental stuff of the universe. And then you have to somehow explain where the material world comes from. And that's a leap that we haven't been able to figure out or make. So, those are the two ways of sort of basically thinking about it. And what we concluded, and I don't know, if this is a valid point or not, but it makes a certain degree of sense. is that maybe, consciousness and matter are sort of two ways of looking at the same thing. It's a little bit of the quantum analogy. And I mean that as an analogy, not that it's based on quantum mechanics, although there's other people who are looking at that. But just that, it may depend a little bit on how you look at it. Like if you have somebody focusing on consciousness, or their own consciousness or being consciousness of something, and you do a brain scan, well, you will find changes in the brain. But whether or not that's generating the experience of consciousness or receiving the experience of consciousness, these are things that at the moment we just don't know. Now, someday we may be able to figure that out. Although, again, this is part of what drove me into the whole infinite doubt thing, which is that how do you? We're caught within our own consciousness. We're living out of our own consciousness, and so our science, our computers, everything that we think about is coming out of that in some way. And I don't mean physically, I don't mean the physical manifestation of it, but it's just that we're trapped within our own consciousness. So it's very hard to know if anything that we're experiencing in the world is just our own experience of it or is really real. And this gets back to that fundamental question. So that's a very long-winded answer to the short answer of I don't know. But it's a fantastic question, and obviously it's a very central one, and one that neurotheology should continue to look at and to explore. I mean, one of the interesting pieces to this is, can we take people like monks and nuns and so forth who can manipulate their consciousness in certain ways and use them as the ability to, try to explore these questions. So that may be a window into trying to figure that out.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. So next question from Ruth. Has anybody ever tried reverse research? And that is basically stimulating areas of the brain and seeing if this has an effect on these spiritual experiences?
Yeah. So there's actually a fairly well-known batch of studies, I guess, if you will. There was a guy named Michael Persinger, who I think has passed away, but he had what was called the God helmet. Where you would put on this helmet and it would emit different radio frequencies into the brain or magnetic frequencies into the brain. In more clinical scenarios, there is now something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which we know can be used to sort of reduce depression or anxiety in people by stimulating or inhibiting certain parts of the brain. So, according to Persinger's claim that he could help to induce these different experiences by emitting these different radio frequencies. And of course, there's the more obvious way of looking at this through, psychedelic compounds, which, you take a drug and it stimulates these experiences. So there are a lot of ways of stimulating these experiences. And it is a very important area of neurotheological research, I think, going forward, which is to look at all the different ways in which we can try to stimulate the brain through meditation, prayer, through psychedelics, through different electromagnetic waves and things like that, and see, what we are able to achieve and what we're not able to achieve. I mean, one of the concerns I had with Persinger's work was that, even though he claimed to be able to elicit an experience of a sensed presence and sort of a little bit of a feeling of oneness, it did not seem that they had the same sort of thorough, fullness and richness of the experiences that people talk about. So, maybe it can help to elicit a certain part of those experiences, but whether or not it can elicit an entire experience that's spiritual like that, I don't know. But drug-induced experiences with compounds like psilocybin or LSD often are described as very spiritual experiences. But one of the good things about them is that we know what they're made of. Like, we know what they do in the brain. They affect the serotonin system in particular. So, that may be something for us to be able to look at and try to understand more specifically. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a very valid point, and it is something that we have been looking at, and myself and some of my colleagues have been looking at in more and more detail.
Very interesting. Okay, so we've got one here from Philip. You've explained the practice, the effects on the brain, and the reactions of practitioners related to enlightenment. But what is the intrinsic experience? In other words, what is the nature of pure spirituality?
Well, this gets back to the point I was trying to make about, learning about the subjective nature of the experience. I mean, part of the problem, even in what we did with the surveys, I mean, we got at it probably closer than most other people have, but it's still, you never know exactly what is being experienced by the person themselves. And so they are deeply personal, very intrinsic experiences for each person. And then ultimately, and of course, well, this is like one of the jokes that I always say, everybody says that they're indescribable experiences, but let me tell you about it. As ineffable as they are, we try. And so then people say, well, it was a powerful feeling of love, or it was a feeling of energy, it was a feeling of a force, it was a feeling of God. And then the question that I have is, well, so when people say, I felt a force, I felt God, I felt energy, are those fundamentally the same experiences that people are just using different words to describe, or are they actually different experiences? Is there a continuum of these experiences? And so sometimes people really do feel energy, whereas other times people really do feel love, and that those are two fundamentally different experiences. I don't know. I mean, my guess is that some especially when they're really discrepant in terms of their descriptions, that they are probably different experiences, but we don't know that yet. And it is. I mean, there's a fundamental challenge of, and this gets again back to my infinite doubt piece, which is, one never. I can never know what your experience is. I mean, I have no way of experiencing what you experience, and so I always just have to take you at your word and your descriptions for what you're saying about your experience. And of course, by the same token, you can never know my experience, and so how do we bridge those gaps? And again, it's a massive challenge for all of cognitive neuroscience and all of philosophy to really to engage those kinds of questions, but they are at the core of the problem.
Very interesting. Now, you're a man of questions, Dr. Newberg. I'm curious to ask, what questions are you most interested in exploring in this field going forward? Like, what's most exciting you right now? Like, what are you looking forward to exploring?
Well, I mean, a lot of the questions that have already been asked me are key questions that I, in my own personal philosophy, that notion of reality and how we come to know it, that is the fundamental question. From the perspective of neurotheology, I alluded to this a few moments ago. I think part of what I'm excited about is trying to see how these concepts can be applied to all the different traditions. And so we wrote a book actually called The Rabbi's Brain that looked at Judaism in the context of neurotheology. And I'm currently working with a nun and a theology scholar. I'm sorry. And so we're working on a treatment with regard to Catholicism. I'm working with a colleague in Egypt. We're looking at Islamic neurotheology. So I'm hoping to be able to bring this to all the different traditions. That to me is another new area of work that I'm excited about. And then from the brain perspective, we are trying to get more and more down to not just the areas of the brain that are active, but some of the neurotransmitter systems like serotonin related to the psychedelics and so forth. So we've been doing some studies looking at serotonin and dopamine. But again, ultimately the fundamental question is still, what's the nature of reality and how do we know what it is? And so that's the piece that will always be at the center of what I'm doing.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Before we go, your website, www.andrewnewberg.com, it's there on the slide. Is there anywhere else you'd recommend people to go online, or any kind of final parting advice you'd give people after this talk?
Well, certainly that website really has most of the research articles and information on the books, and there's also a way to contact me. So if people are interested in asking some more questions or engaging the topic more, feel free to reach out. And hopefully I was just able to generate a lot of personal interest and help people to explore their own experiences and their own ways of thinking about things. And hopefully this gives people some new ways of thinking about the experiences that they've had, and trying to understand how to incorporate that into their lives. And hopefully, I think to me, one of the big take-home messages to leave people with is something that I said a little earlier. We all have these intrinsic experiences, and I think what this data ultimately shows us is that all of us are kind of in the same boat. We all have a brain that's incredibly finite, limited, fallible, and it's looking at an infinite universe. and trying to make some sense out of it. So it is not a surprise that we come to different conclusions, and that instead of berating and being negative and sort of denigrating people who have different perspectives than us, maybe to look at this data and try to understand how and why we each come to our different perspectives, and maybe try to find ways of supporting each other and being more compassionate and understanding about those who have come to conclusions that are different from us, because we're ultimately all in that same boat of infinite doubt, and we're all just trying to figure it out. And maybe if we all work together, we'll do a better job of getting to those answers, rather than if we're all trying to tear each other down.
Very true, very true. Well, Dr. Newberg, this has been a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that spent their Sunday learning about these subjects. It's a credit to you all. Thank you to Sinead for all the customer support, and I hope to see you all at a future event at some point, whenever this lockdown COVID situation ends. So thanks again, everybody, and I'll see you soon.